Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before we get started on today's topic, let us know down in the comments where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear where everyone's joining us from. Now, let's jump into something that's been making a ton of noise lately.
hmm
The possible TikTok ban in the U.S. It seems like it's everywhere these days,
hmm
from news to late-night talk shows. What are your first reactions to all this? Have you been following all the updates? Or is it kind of hard to keep up with all the craziness?
Yeah, it's definitely a wild situation, lots of moving pieces. So it's understandable if it's a bit overwhelming trying to follow it all. What's really unusual is that it's ended up in the Supreme Court.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're going to be hearing arguments about a law that could actually force TikTok's Chinese owners to sell the app,
Wow.
or even face a complete shutdown here in the US.
Okay, so let's break this down a little. Complete shutdown, that seems extreme. What exactly is this law?
Yeah.
And what's behind this whole push to potentially ban, one of the most popular social media platforms out there?
Well, the law itself was actually passed by Congress back in April 2024. And get this, it had bipartisan support.
Oh, wow. That's rare.
Yeah, pretty rare these days. The main concern behind the law is national security. There's a real worry that the Chinese government could access user data through TikTok or even try to influence the content on the platform.
So it's kind of like a tug of war between, national security on one side and the freedom to use and enjoy a social media platform on the other. Listeners, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think the potential national security risks outweigh the benefits of TikTok, or is this maybe going too far?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? It's this exact tension that the Supreme Court's going to have to figure out as they look at this law. But here's where it gets interesting. TikTok's not just sitting back. They're fighting back hard, arguing that this law actually violates the First Amendment, specifically the part about free speech.
Whoa, that's a big statement. Are they saying that posting dance videos and, comedy skits is protected by the Constitution? I mean, I love a good TikTok trend, don't get me wrong, but it's not exactly like political discourse, or protesting, is it?
Right. It's a bit more nuanced than that. TikTok's argument is that the algorithms they use and how they pick what content to show you, that's a form of expression that's protected under the First Amendment. They're basically saying their content choices are like the decisions a newspaper or a publisher makes.
Oh, right.
The government shouldn't be able to tell them how to present that content, just like they can't censor a newspaper for articles that criticize the government.
That's a really interesting argument, I got to say. But what proof do they have that there's no manipulation going on?
Well, TikTok says there's no evidence that ByteDance, their parent company, has ever messed with content or censored users because of pressure from the Chinese government. They're pushing back against this idea that they're controlled by the Chinese government, essentially. What's interesting here is this case could really change how we think about social media when it comes to free speech. It raises big questions. Is social media a place for protected expression like traditional media? Where's the line between free speech and national security in this digital world? Those are the kinds of things the Supreme Court has to figure out, and their decision could have a huge impact. So, listeners, what do you think? Do you agree with TikTok, or do you think national security has to come first in this situation?
It's definitely not a simple issue. There are no easy answers here.
Yeah.
But there's another layer to this whole thing. The Supreme Court actually decided to fast-track this case,
Yeah.
which means they know how important it is. But there's no clear timeline for a decision yet.
It's hard to say how long they'll take, especially with how complex everything is. But one thing we know for sure is that this case has huge implications. Not just for TikTok, but maybe for how social media is regulated in general going forward. If the Supreme Court upholds this law, it could mean governments have more power to control online platforms, which could really affect free speech and expression online. Something to think about, isn't it? How would you feel if other social media platforms you use were suddenly under those same regulations?
That's a great point, and it makes you wonder about the future of online freedom. So let's get into the specifics a bit. What exactly is the government worried about?
Well, their biggest worry is data. They say that because TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, it basically creates a way for the Chinese government to get a hold of tons of data on American citizens. They could use it for things like surveillance or to figure out who might be easily influenced by certain campaigns.
So they're saying TikTok could become a tool for spying or even messing with elections. Are they saying that's already happening, or is it more of like a what-if scenario?
They haven't actually shown any proof that data is being given directly to the Chinese government.
Okay.
Their argument is more about the potential risk. They're saying Chinese law makes companies like ByteDance hand over data if the government asks for it. So it's that possibility that has them worried.
It sounds like they're going with the whole better safe than sorry approach.
Hmm.
But is that really enough to justify something this drastic? This kind of brings us back to the main point, doesn't it? What do you think, listeners? Is the chance of data sharing enough to ban the app, even if there's no proof that anything bad's actually happened?
It's a tough one for sure. Data privacy is super important, and we've all seen what can happen when data gets leaked or misused.
Yeah.
But at the same time, banning a whole platform based on something that might happen seems pretty extreme, especially when you think about how it would affect millions of users and creators.
Right. It's not just about data, is it? TikTok is also saying this law is stepping on their freedom of expression. They're saying their algorithms and the choices they make about content are like a form of speech protected by the First Amendment. It's like saying the way they present and arrange content is an expression in itself.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting argument. It really makes you think about how free speech ideas work in our digital world. Traditionally, it's been about protecting what we say and write, but social media makes things more complicated.
Right.
Algorithms have a huge influence on what we see and how we interact online. And if you start thinking of algorithms as a kind of speech, then regulating them brings up some really tough First Amendment questions. What do you all think about that, listeners? Is there a way to deal with these national security worries without messing with free speech?
It feels like we're trying to jam a square peg into a round hole.
Hmm.
The laws we have now were made way before the internet, and they're having trouble keeping up with how fast technology and online platforms are changing. It's like we're always trying to catch up, but we can't forget this legal fight is also happening in the political world, and things can get really messy there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And just to make things more interesting, we've got President-elect Trump getting involved too.
Of course we do. It wouldn't be a major news story without some Trump drama, would it?
Yeah.
So what's his take on all of this? Is he for the ban against it or somewhere in between?
Well, his stance on TikTok has been all over the place, which just adds another layer of confusion to an already complicated situation.
Yeah, for sure.
What we do know is that he's filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court. It's basically a legal document from someone who's not directly involved in the case but wants to give their opinion or expertise.
So he's basically weighing in because he's interested, but what's he actually saying? What is his argument?
He's asking the Supreme Court to hold off on making a decision until after he takes office.
Okay.
He's suggesting that maybe he can work out a deal between TikTok and Congress once he's president. He even calls himself one of the most powerful, prolific, and influential users of social media in history in the brief, and says that the current situation is making it harder for him to manage U.S. foreign policy.
Wow, that's so typical Trump, isn't it? Always making it about him. But seriously, do you think him getting involved will actually change the Supreme Court's mind? I mean, they're supposed to be impartial, right?
It's hard to say for sure. The Supreme Court is supposed to work independently from political pressure.
All right.
But there's no denying that Trump is great at getting attention and influencing what people think. Whether that will actually influence the justices, we'll have to wait and see. It definitely adds an interesting twist to this whole thing, though.
Speaking of twists, let's not forget about the money side of all this. There's a lot at stake, isn't it? We're talking billions of dollars. What happens to TikTok's U.S. operations if they're forced to sell?
Oh, if ByteDance has to sell TikTok's U.S. assets, it could be one of the biggest tech deals ever. There are already a bunch of potential buyers interested, like Project Liberty.
Aye.
They're a group backed by billionaire Frank McCourt, and even Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank has said he's interested.
Hold on, Mr. Wonderful wants to buy TikTok. That's a mental image I wasn't prepared for. But seriously, the financial side of this case is massive. It shows just how much these social media platforms are worth. They're such a big part of our lives and have such a global reach that it's no wonder a company like TikTok is valued at billions. But what does all this mean for the average TikTok user? What's the worst that could happen? Are they going to wake up one morning and the app's just gone from their phones?
Well, that is a possibility if the Supreme Court decides to uphold the law and ByteDance can't find a buyer by that January 19th deadline.
Right.
But it's more likely that there would be some kind of transition period or a different solution for users. It's hard to imagine the app just disappearing overnight.
Okay, so maybe a gradual phase out instead of a sudden shutdown. But even a gradual ban would be a big deal for TikTok's creators and users, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. For a lot of creators, TikTok is how they make a living.
Yeah.
They rely on the platform to connect with their audience, build their brand, and earn money. A ban would really hurt their careers and how they make a living. And for the millions of people who use TikTok for entertainment, news, and to connect with others, losing access to the platform would be a huge disruption.
It could be like a digital earthquake shaking up the whole social media world. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have to wait for the Supreme Court's decision. It's a lot to process, isn't it, listeners? A complex legal battle with high stakes, political maneuvering, and even a bit of celebrity drama. And it all comes down to fundamental questions about national security, free speech, and the power of these digital platforms.
It really does feel like we're at a turning point, doesn't it? This case could completely change how social media works, not just here, but all over the world.
It's like we're all holding our breath waiting to see what happens. But before we wrap things up, I want to hear your predictions, listeners.
Yeah.
What do you think the Supreme Court will do? Will they go with the government and maybe force a sale? Or will they side with TikTok and say their free speech argument wins? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We're really interested to hear what you think will happen.
I wish I knew, but honestly, it's really hard to say. There are strong arguments on both sides, and the justices could decide either way. What I find interesting is that this case is bigger than just TikTok. It's a test case for how we're going to handle foreign-owned social media platforms from now on.
Like it's setting a precedent, right? Whatever the Supreme Court decides will affect other platforms too, and maybe even influence how other countries decide to regulate social media. If the U.S. starts restricting foreign-owned platforms, could other countries do the same thing? They have national security concerns too. It could create a really messy and unpredictable online world.
Yeah, that's a key question, isn't it? Where do we draw the line? How do we balance real national security concerns with protecting free speech online? And how do we make sure these incredibly powerful platforms are being used responsibly without stopping innovation and creativity?
These are huge questions, and we're not going to have answers right away. It's going to take a lot of careful thought and discussion. But this TikTok case has definitely put these issues front and center. It's making us face some uncomfortable truths about how social media fits into our lives and the challenges it creates for our legal and political systems. What are your thoughts on this, listeners? Do you think there's a way to find that balance, or are we going to keep seeing conflicts like this pop up?
I think it's important to remember that even if TikTok gets through this legal battle, it's probably just the start of a much bigger conversation about how to regulate social media, especially when it comes to foreign ownership and national security. We're really just starting to understand how complicated these platforms are and how they affect the world.
It's like we've opened Pandora's box, and now we have to figure out how to deal with all the stuff that came out. It's clear that this TikTok case is just the beginning. There's a lot more to come in the world of social media regulation, and it's going to be fascinating to watch, even if it gets bumpy along the way.
I think that's a great point to end on. This case has so many different angles, and it's really got us thinking about the future of the internet. We'll definitely be watching closely to see how it all plays out, and we'll keep you, our amazing listeners, in the loop about any big developments.
Absolutely. And we want to hear from you. What are your final thoughts and predictions? What do you think the future holds for TikTok and for social media regulation in general? Share your insights in the comments. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the TikTok saga. It's been a wild ride, and we can't wait to see what happens next. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those comments coming.